Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Valley podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Frank Hughes and Dr. Robert M. Price. And today we're talking about the two letters to the Corinthians, or the Corinthian correspondence. The Corinthian correspondence is the book that Frank Hughes and the late Bob Jewett wrote. Robert Price has also written about the Corinthian letters, appearing to be multiple letters conflated together in books like The Amazing Colossal Apostle. Other links to the books in the description below and the pinned comment for anyone who wants to get their copies of these books. So Frank and Bob, without further ado, thank you both for joining me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure as always.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you both for joining me. So I'd like to get the different perspectives from both of you, because both of you agree with each other that 1 and 2 Corinthians were multiple letters that were compressed together. How many letters they were that were compressed, you both might have different numbers for that. And you both have different perspectives on if Paul wrote any of it or not. Bob takes the position that Paul did not write those texts that were fused together, whereas you, Frank, think that he did. So I just want to get both of y'all's perspectives on this matter.
Okay.
Well, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, please.
I think that it's a question of which paradigm, and I admit my approach to it is certainly speculative, and there's no way to know unless somebody who goes for that mythic seminar, post-mortem seminar on the Bible in heaven, where they tell you all the answers. Son of a gun, why didn't I think of that? But to me, the big question is what approach could explain what seemed to me a bunch of contradictions that seemed to follow one on the coattails of the other, which just makes me think that what we have here is really a patchwork quilt of different Paulinist views, whatever that would mean, Marcionites or Gnostics or both, or them and early Catholics. I just wrote to Marcus Vincent and asked him how he views the compilation of the Pauline, of the Apostolicon in its earliest version, which we can only speculate about, because is it analogous to the way he thinks that the Marcionite gospel was added to and revised by other readers, and then Marcion coming up with the definitive edition, incorporating some of the additions to it, but not all, and then Irenaeus or whoever, as Marcus Vincent says, then he added it, and then you have a whole other letters added by Marcionites, by Catholics, by Gnostics. Like Colossians seems to me more of an incipiently Valentinian Gnostic work, more so than a Marcionite work, but you can see how they would have been interested in each other's works and were contemporaries and so forth. But I admit, raising questions like that, you really are in a funhouse mirror zone. There's no way to be sure. It's just that I can see. But I'm equally interested in the approach you're taking, where you say, let's assume Paul did write all this stuff. It's no surprise that these ancient texts weren't handled right for a long time. I mean, even within the churches that received them, there would have been parts of each one that some faction of the congregation didn't like. And so who knows who had charge of the letters and what they did to them. Were they a pile of scraps? And I think of the Dead Sea Scrolls scholars today with their tweezers and all these postage stamp fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, trying to put them together. Is that what they had to do? it wouldn't be surprising. That may sound far-fetched, but I think we know it isn't. I don't think we're far-fetched. And can you harmonize the seeming contradictions by that? I only got your reconstruction, Dr. Hughes, a couple of hours ago, and spent about an hour trying to produce a readable text rather than just the citation numbers. And I haven't had time to really go through it and see how it reads. So I'm shamefully ill prepared. I needed to have had a hold of it longer.
Well, I need to send you a copy of the book. And what you saw where it says Jewett-Hughes partition theory, that's Appendix 1. And then Appendix 3 is other people's partition theories. And that's in the book on about page 271 or something. And then Appendix 4 at the very end of the book, well before the indices, is my translation of letters A through H. In other words, my particular translation of letter A and then letter B, etc., sequentially through H. So hopefully that would be helpful.
Oh yeah,
for you.
That. Wow.
And when Bob Jewett was teaching, he actually gave his students, cutting and pasting. I think it was the New English Bible. And then I think one of them was goldenrod, and the one that was blue was the Greek New Testament. And he actually did that cutting and pasting so that the students could read it either in Greek or in English. And so I think that makes it very helpful. And I agree with you that whatever method or methods, I don't think you can just use one method, but whatever method or methods you use, that really makes a big difference. And also what you think about the history of Pauline Christianity or Paulinism makes a big difference. And of course, how you unravel the Corinthian correspondence and how you unravel the letters that were, the Deutero-Pauline and pastoral letters, how you unravel that history makes a big difference to your unraveling of the history of Paul and of the history of Paulinism. At the end of my dissertation, which Bob Jewett directed and disagreed with, I said that when you look at 2 Thessalonians, and I argued that it was sort of the right-wing attack on the kind of left-wing Paulinism of Colossians and Ephesians. I argued that Colossians and Ephesians had the image of the Paul of heavenly teaching. And I sort of interpreted them in that kind of Gnosticizing direction. I didn't use that term. I stayed away from that term. And then I argued that 2 Thessalonians was against that, and that they or something like them were the letters, the people who say by a letter as from us that the day of the Lord has already come, and that 2 Thessalonians represented the Paul of apocalyptic retaliation. And then for the pastoral, at least for 1 Timothy and Titus, I'm not really sure what to do with 2 Timothy, but for Paul and for 1 and 2 Timothy, 1 Timothy and Titus, I call that the Paul of ecclesiastical, what would I call it? The Paul of ecclesiastical authority. And of course, I'm dealing with the whole issue of, the issue of how the church ought to be structured with bishops, presbyters, deacons, and widows, and whomever. So I argued in that dissertation 40 years ago, I argued that you could not reduce the Pauls of the post-Pauline period to a single Paul, to a single image of Paul, that you had to look at 3 images of Paul in the New Testament. namely the Paul of heavenly teaching, the Paul of apocalyptic retaliation, and the Paul of ecclesiastical authority, and that you couldn't just say one of them was the real Paul after Paul died. So I think analogously, the Paul of the redaction of 1 Corinthians is a lot closer to the Paul of ecclesiastical authority than anything else, as I would put it.
Way,
in other words, go ahead, please.
Oh, just to back up what you're saying there, I remember when I first noticed that the structure now concerning so-and-so, fictively, I think it says now for the things you asked about, and then now concerning this, now concerning that. I thought, this sounds an awful lot like the Didache, which makes no bones about being a personal letter. It's admittedly like a church manual. And it would not surprise me, as you say, if 1 Corinthians is another member of the same genre, basically.
Well, and I mean, at the end of Didache, just about at the end of Didache, you've got all that apocalyptic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so the apocalyptic stuff, in Pauline Christianity after Paul's death, the Gnosticizing stuff could exist and did exist, but then also the apocalyptically based or the apocalypse sounding stuff also existed. Mm-hmm. And so all sorts of streams of thought didn't die.
Right, right.
And analogously, in respect of the Synoptic Gospels, you have you have Mark telling his readers what schmoes the apostles were. They're schmoes. They only have two problems. They're stupid and they're disloyal. And, the women who go to the empty tomb, and the women don't even say anything to anybody. And most notably, they don't say anything to the male apostles. So in Mark, the male apostles are not the guarantors of the Jesus tradition. Whereas maybe the most profound editing in the New Testament is the Matthean redaction of Mark, where you have Jesus as a teacher, and the disciples are mathetai, disciples, students. And of course, what happens after the main teacher dies or departs? The best students become the new teachers. And so then in Matthew, you have Jesus with all these 5 discourses, I suppose, and then the apostles are the new teachers. They are the disciples. They are the mathetai, students, and then they go teach. And then what does Jesus tell them to do in the Great Commission? Go and teach. Whatsoever things I taught you, you teach them. So it's just, there's profound editing going on in I would say late 1st century Christianity, and indeed early 2nd century Christianity, that essentially you have this radical Jesus, and you have this radical the writer of the Gospel of Mark, and then that kind of gets domesticated in Matthew. And you could certainly argue that the radical Paul, as I would see it, gets to a great extent domesticated in the pastoral epistles. The charismatic structure of authority, where you have apostles and presbyters and deacons and pastors and teachers in Paul and also in Ephesians, that gets subsumed into one apostle per church, or one bishop per church, and then you have presbyters, and then you have diaconoi, who are now subordinate ministers to the presbyters and deacons. Whereas in Paul's own letters, Paul can say of himself and Apollos, we are diakonoi in 1 Corinthians 3:8. So there's all sorts of interesting transmogrifications that's taking place. We know it takes place in the Synoptic Gospels. We know it takes place in respect of the Gospel of John. And so why should we expect that wouldn't somehow take place within the Pauline corpus?
Right. I mean, there are 2 or 3 places where Paul says, now this is my signature, as if you'd have to say that if it were really reading somebody's signature. And this is the mark of authenticity in all my letters. And then there's the one in Thessalonians you mentioned. Don't be upset by some letter supposedly by me. These are like admissions that there's a cottage industry of Pauline fabrications going on. And most scholars, of course, think that there are only the lucky 7 genuine epistles. I'm not so sure that's the case. Even if you're willing to admit that there are 6 fakes in there, where do you stop? I don't know if you can, because I always think of the parallel, if it's a true parallel, I think so, with Petrine writings. We got a truckload of these things: an Apocalypse of Peter, the Charagmata of Peter, the Journeys of Peter, the Gospel of Peter, and the Acts of Peter, and so on. Nobody thinks he wrote this stuff, and critical scholars don't think he wrote 1st or 2nd Peter. I mean, they already don't give the time of day to the notion that he might have written 3rd and 4th Peter, namely the letter of Peter to James, the letter of Peter to Philip. No. Well, these are just as different in their way too. And if you scratch all of those off, as my favorites, the Dutch radicals, did, why should it seem so odd that possibly even all of the Pauline ascribed texts are spurious, and that Paul is named simply to grab a big name, like obviously Peter was? It really throws the whole idea of genuineness up for grabs in a way you don't really see wrestled with anymore. People just bury the Van Manen and Bruno Bauer on the subject. They won't translate their works, so most people haven't even heard of them. But what you're doing, like what Schmidhals and others did, that is really great stuff.
Well, thank you. Well, what Bob Jewett and I tried to do, and of course, Robert Jewett was very much a, well, he was, as you know, he wrote a dissertation in Tübingen. He had studied with Ernst Käsemann, and previously he had studied with Marcus Bart at the University of Chicago. And then he did the dissertation was sponsored by Otto Michel. And then it was in Michel's series. And in his book, Paul's Anthropological Terms, the original dissertation, the Pauline Anthropological Terms, included the chronology first, and then the analysis of the anthropological terms: flesh, spirit, conscience, all of those. And then the chronology book was published in 1979, but the Paul's Anthropological Terms was published in the AGJU series, volume 10. And I believe it was 1971. And so the way that Bob Jewett thought was, radically historical. In other words, he believed that you couldn't reasonably talk about what Paul meant by flesh, for example, without, shall we say, earthing it, tying it to historical situations. And he argued that what Paul meant by flesh, and of course, interestingly and importantly, First Thessalonians has got no flesh versus spirit. It's got no Old Testament quotations. Paul only speaks of himself as an apostle almost in passing. He doesn't put the title apostolus in the epistolary prescript. You got no flesh versus spirit, and you've got no circumcision controversy. And you've got apparently no controversy over Paul's authority as an apostle in First Thessalonians. And therefore, we believe, Bob and I and Gerd Ludemann and quite a few others who have studied First Thessalonians believe that it predates the Jerusalem conference. And of course, as soon as you do that, in Acts, of course, you've got Paul founding the church in Thessaloniki in Acts 17, but the Jerusalem conference is in Acts 15. So you've got that chronological peccadillo right there. But in other words, you couldn't really talk about justification by faith and flesh versus spirit and all of that until Galatians. And therefore, the circumcision controversy that evoked the Jerusalem conference, and then the problem after the Jerusalem conference that evoked Galatians. So in other words, when you studied with Bob Jewett of happy memory, you're studying a radically situational Paul, unabashedly, unapologetically situational. Does this mean that Paul is not theological? Not for a moment. But in other words, Jewett wanted to read the theology of each letter and see the theological response in each letter that was a response to a particular historical situation in each letter. And that's that's part of what we tried to do in our Corinthian book. And of course, in letter A, Paul has said, well, I've heard there's divisions among you, and I partly believe it. And then in 11:19, he says, well, divisions aren't so bad. This is how you tell who the genuine people are. And then in letter B, Paul hears that there is porneia going on. There's not only porneia going on, but also people are doubting the resurrection of the dead. And of course, that sounds very suspiciously like a type of proto-Gnosticism. And then he writes to refute those who deny the resurrection of the dead. And he writes to tell the people who are visiting prostitutes, by the way, you can't do that. And then Paul gets the detailed report from those of Chloe, where you have, the people who say, I am of Paul, I am of Cephas, I am of Apollos, and even, as Bauer thought, I am of the Gnostic party. And so Paul now completely does believe that the Corinthian church is divided up into 4 factions. And so he writes a really striking letter with a 3-part proof and a peroratio to attack those who are dividing up the church. And of course, he also writes in response to their letter to him about, well, okay, what do we do about speaking in tongues? What do we do about this? What do we do about that? And of course, he responds polemically in 1 Corinthians 4:8. Already you are rich. Already you are kings. Well, hell, I wish you were kings so that we could reign along with you, So, and then, of course, he writes that letter, which doesn't work. And then he thinks it would work. And then he writes a fundraising letter, 2 Corinthians 8. But the problem there is he now is appointing the people who are going to carry the money. And that caused a big stir. And then in Corinthian letter, that was letter D. And then in letter E, Paul starts defending himself for the first time. And then that letter didn't work. And then Paul made the second visit to Corinth, and then he was rejected by the Corinthian church as their founding apostle. And then he writes the nasty letter, 2 Corinthians 10 through 13. And that is the only, he had to hit them between the eyes. And that's the only thing that kind of got their attention. And then after he wrote the nasty letter, then he has to write, then the nasty letter caused there to be a big stir, and they started being reconciled to Paul. And then he writes letter G, the letter of reconciliation, to try to cement the reconciliation in place. And then at the end of that, after that, he writes letter H, which is not written to the Corinthian church, but is written to the churches of Achaia. So Bob Jewett thought that letter D, 2 Corinthians 8, meant that they hadn't really collected the money and jewels, precious metals. Whereas 2 Corinthians 9 to the churches of Achaia is they've probably collected it, and it's being guarded in somebody's basement by some trusted slaves. But Paul wasn't sure that they were actually going to give it to them when they made their way to Corinth on the way to Jerusalem. So anyway, you really have a Duke's mixture of things that are going on in the Corinthian church and things that are going on in Paul's very difficult relationship with the Corinthian church. And then Paul uses different ways of doing rhetoric in each of those letters. Of course, 1 Corinthians letter C is a complete letter. Letter G, the letter of reconciliation, is a complete letter. And then letter E, where he starts defending himself, is mostly a complete letter. It doesn't have the epistolary prescript, but it's got the thanksgiving prayer, and it certainly has the peroratio. So using rhetorical criticism and criticism of letters, we were able to piece together the rhetoric of these letters and letter fragments. And I think we were able to give a pretty consistent picture of what Paul was doing in the different segments of the Corinthian correspondence. That's what we tried to do.
That situational approach, I just automatically think of James Dunn in his Unity and Diversity in the New Testament, where he says, okay, let's admit that there are so many differences here that maybe we ought to look at canonical authority as a tether. There's plenty of motion available, but it sets some limits, but it canonizes diversity. And why is there such diversity? Well, because they're winging it. Because particular questions arise in particular circumstances. That's what we're hearing. Obviously, it's not a systematic abstract theology textbook, as some people would like to make it, but that is a very helpful thing. What is going on here? Why is this being addressed? And would Paul say the same thing if certain problems weren't occurring? And if they're not occurring, then are you one silly sounding example? I was talking years ago with a guy who led a Catholic charismatic prayer group. And they had speaking in tongues, and it didn't go out of control or anything. It was very edifying and so on. But I noticed that there were maybe 5 or 6 people speaking in tongues. And I asked him non-combatively, doesn't it make it pretty clear in 1 Corinthians that 2 or 3 at most should? And he said, well, yes, but you see, Paul was dealing with a situation that had gotten out of hand. It was a problematic special situation. And if you don't have chaos, people are thinking these people are nuts, then you probably wouldn't need that limitation. So that's why they didn't have it. And I thought, yes, why didn't I think of that? And that could probably be extended a whole lot of things in these letters. Is he pronouncing, thunderings from Mount Sinai, eternal commandments, or is it situational theology? And that makes hermeneutics both more confusing, but also less legalistic. So there's definite theological implications of these critical questions, and I think it's a liberating kind of an awareness. And you're really making
Well,
a good day.
one of the things, yeah. Well, one of the things in terms of, a canon, we don't have a New Testament canon. For that matter, there was not an Old Testament canon at this time either, nor a firm text. But one of the things that we did is that after what Bob did was the first three chapter 1 was sort of a pre-summary of the whole book because the book is so complex. And then chapters 2, 3, and 4 are, okay, why would you want to partition 2 Corinthians? And then the next chapter was, why would you want to partition 1 Corinthians? And then the next chapter was the redaction process of 1 Corinthians. And then chapters 5 through 12 were my chapters. He did chapter 6 on letter B because I had a lot of trouble wrapping my mind for a lot of years around letter B. So he did that chapter, but I did the others of 5 and then 7 through 12. And then chapter 13 was to say, okay, if what we say is true, how do you plug that into the history of Paulinism? And so that was an attempt on my part to sort of say, okay, if this is going on in the Corinthian church, then what does this say to us about the pastoral epistles, especially, and what was going on with the Deutero-Pauline letters as well as the pastorals? And then his chapter 14 was the final chapter of the book, and was the question of the publication of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And of course, it was the subtitle of that chapter was From Scroll to Codex. Originally you had papyrus rolls, and they were relatively easy to cut and paste. See? And then one of the things that Harry Gamble in his book, Books and Readers in the Early Church from 1995, was he thought that the thing that really brought why the early Christians rejected scrolls and went to the bound book, the codex, was actually the publication of the Pauline corpus. And so Bob Jewett took that one step further in his final writing and say, it wasn't just particularly the Pauline corpus, it was the publication of this thing called 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Reject papyrus rolls, which the letters were originally on papyrus rolls. And so once you put them in a bound book, once you put them in a codex, they're harder to cut and paste. And so that was the end of our book, is the move away from papyrus rolls towards the bound book, i.e. the codex. And so that's what happened, we think, with the Corinthian letters being edited from eight letters and letter fragments that we did identify to the canonical form or the New Testament form of 1st Corinthians and 2nd Corinthians. And then later, of course, you have the publication of this thing called the Pauline corpus, which is very much a Duke's mixture. But of course, you have obviously, I think, authentic letters. But on the other hand, Romans certainly has Romans, as Bob Jewett saw it, was about tolerance and about getting people to agree to cooperate on the Spanish mission. And yet in Romans 16, 17 through 20, okay, anybody that's causing problems, kick their butts out, and that's a very, very interesting interpolation at the end of Romans 16. And then of course you have then the inauthentic letters, namely the first Deutero-Pauline letter, I would say, would be Colossians. The writer of Ephesians had a copy of Colossians and did some editing of that. I think the writer of Second Thessalonians had a copy of First Thessalonians, but was really uptight about letters as from us that would say, at least from that author's apocalyptic point of view, that the day of the Lord has already come. And then, of course, the pastoral epistles, First Timothy and Titus, are about church order. And then it's hard to know what to say about Second Timothy, sort of the swan song, I'm ready to die now. So the Pauline corpus is a mixture of authentic and inauthentic Pauline letters, relatively unedited and then very edited in the case of the Corinthian letters. And of course, look at the Synoptic Gospels. You have a lot of oral tradition, as I believe, standing behind Mark, and yet Mark is trying to make John the Baptist and Jesus imitate Elijah and Elisha and do miracles. Elijah does 8 miracles and Elisha does 16 miracles. And when Jesus does 16 miracles, then in Mark 7:37, the people say he has done all things well. And then Jesus does 8 more miracles. So I think all kind of imitatio is going on in early Christian literature, both in the Synoptic Gospels and also in the Pauline corpus.
Yes.
And, early Christians clearly, they did not hesitate to look at, read, oppose, and edit each other's texts.
Mm-hmm. And that's, like when you look at the way the Olivet Discourse really gets altered in Luke and Matthew, you realize just what Revelation is talking about when it says keep your mitts off of this text. If you cut anything out or add anything to it, you're going to be damned. Well, I'm just paranoid. Is that? No, just look at the Synoptic Apocalypse. He knew that's what would happen. I think First Enoch has a similar warning because they knew what people did with these things. We hear that ancient authors didn't have the idea of copyright and that an author was the possessor of his text. I don't know. I don't think that's particularly true in light of these anxieties about falling into the hands of others. And we're told Marcion said when he had his students read his first draft, and he said, hey, don't show this to anybody. It's not a finished work. And they read it and said, man, this is so great. I know we're not supposed to, but I got to share this with Gaius over here and Crispus over there. And it gets back to Marcion. He says, this is just what I was trying to avoid. Well, there it is again. That's I can improve on this, and he shouldn't have put this in. I'll do him a favor and get rid of it. That must have been pretty common. We're lucky we have at least a few examples of it.
Well, just go back to the Sermon on the Mount within Matthew, but particularly within the Sermon on the Mount, if there was a Sermon on the Mount community, anyone takes any of these commandments and makes them small, anyone who discounts or minimizes any of these commandments, he shall be the least in the kingdom of God. And then anyone who takes these commandments, the Hebrew Bible, and makes them great and practices them, he shall be great within the kingdom. So, you know, there's kind of right in this having to do with behavior, and part of behavior is how do you deal with the tradition? You know, how do you interpret Holy Writ? And people who take Holy Writ and kind of minimize it and say, well, it's no damn good. We have to do something new now. And you take the Hebrew Bible and you say, well, we don't care for that anymore. That doesn't pertain to us anymore. That's the kind of person who shall be least in the Sermon on the Mount community. You know, there's ranking that goes on in these early Jesus communities. And obviously that's not so different from, other kinds of communities, including philosophical communities and other religious communities.
I think of the passage you're talking about in Matthew 5:17 through 19, based on a Hughes saying, or if you go that route. But what's in Matthew that isn't in Luke is this warning against people that say Jesus. What was Jesus' role? What was his purpose? Well, he came to abolish the scriptures, the law and the prophets, but don't listen to him. No. I came to fulfill them. Who could he be talking about there? Well, Paul doesn't ever say we should. I mean, in any of his letters, that you should abolish the Hebrew scriptures. I think he's talking about Marcion, and of course, it's not actually Jesus. It's Matthew, whoever he was, and that's again just as you say, the question of minimizing or magnifying the scriptures. Which one you're going to do? Or you're going to go right down the middle like the Ebionites and say, well, basically, yes, it is inspired and authoritative, but some trickster snuck a bunch of phonies in there, and luckily it's not too hard to ferret them out and get rid of them. Well, I think Sheps said that he thought that was a Jewish Christian reaction to Marcion. Well, they've got some points there. There are problems with it, but that doesn't mean you throw the baby out with the baptismal water. So let's try to fix it. So it's this whole range of, what kind of surgery are we going to do, if any? Or we're going to leave it in there and try contrived ways to make it sound like it's saying what it something other than it looks like it's saying.
Well, I think that is the big problem, for early Christian communities, is how do you value the Hebrew Bible, the so-called Old Testament? How do you value it, but also say, well, it's not the final word. So I mean, this is a perennial problem in the church, etc. But what was I going to say? Well, I mean, for example, looking at the Matthean and Lucan redaction of Mark, assuming Markan priority, Matthew and Luke like Mark, except when they don't. In other words, they use the Mark as the skeleton, and they use the Markan stuff all but around 30 verses are in Matthew and Luke in one way or another. And when one diverges from the Markan order, the other one generally speaking doesn't. On the other hand, they are really uptight, I think, about no resurrection appearances, and they want to have a more fuller biography of Jesus. Okay, well, who is this Jesus and where did he come from? And if we say that he's Son of God, with the baptism of Jesus, the voice from heaven says, "You are my Son, the beloved." addressing him in the second person singular. Okay, well, how did Jesus become the Son of God? Well, he became the Son of God because God, the Holy Spirit, was the Virgin Mary, etc. So this is how Jesus had a human birth, which was also a divine birth. So, there's theologizing going on by Matthew and Luke. Jesus is mostly a miracle worker in Mark, whereas in Matthew, Jesus is mostly a teacher. And then Luke is very much into Jesus teaching, and he adds a bunch of teaching material, particularly in the Lucan travel narratives in 951 through 18. So they like Mark a lot, and they use Mark as the skeleton, the anatomy of their gospel, and yet they're willing to add to it rather remarkably in some identical ways or almost identical ways, and also some different ways. So they're willing to take Mark, but they're also willing in a big way to edit Mark. So why should that not be true of the letters of the Pauline corpus?
Right. My friend and mentor Darrell Dowdy, blessed memory, I'll never forget how he said that scholars using form criticism don't have any trouble recognizing the patchwork nature of the synoptic tradition, that you'll look in vain for any logical progression often in what's being said. Like, I think Mark 10 somewhere, it's like just catchwords. There's no real consistent theme. He's just putting it together with the only principal connection he can think of. And he says, why has it taken so long for people to recognize the same thing in the epistles? He says, how many commentaries are taken up entirely with trying to say how passage B follows from passage A when it doesn't seem to. And so eventually you have all of these, you've got more mortar than bricks almost. And I thought, geez, that's right. And I think of another teacher I revere, Gordon Fee, said that you've got to ask, not in the Gospels, not just what does it mean, but what's the point? And in that, he seemed to mean, why is A next to B? And that opens the door, I'm afraid, to what Dowdy pointed out. Well, it's, by God, it's got to fit in there somewhere. And if it was meaning this, well, then it would fit in. So I guess it must have meant this. I'm not so sure about that. It may just be a rag bag of goodies, and that they didn't know how to put together. Sermon on the Mount, is there any real progression of thought in that? Well, no, nor does there need to be. It's just a collection of these great sayings.
Well, on the other hand, when you look at individual letters that are relatively unedited, for example, First Thessalonians, I think, is a very unedited letter. Romans, with the exception of 16, 17 through 20, is an integral letter. Galatians is an integral letter. There are some other Philippians I don't know what to do with. I've never been able to decide about Philippians. Philemon is an integral letter, but does Philemon even have a theology? I don't think so. But on the other hand, some letters, I mean, when you can use rhetorical criticism, and in rhetoric, in other words, you have the beginning of the speech and the seeking of goodwill, and then in the narratio, you sort of have a statement of facts to begin, and then you frequently have a partitio where you say, I'm going to talk about this and this and this and this, and then you have a 3-part proof or a 5-part proof. and the proofs get more and more serious and more difficult, which is exactly what Cicero said you can do. And then you have that recapitulated with a peroratio, an epilogos. Then that gives you a very good idea of that gives you a way of demonstrating the basic coherence of those letters that are coherent. When you can see things that are announced in the exordium briefly and then listed in a partitio or a propositio, and then you have a 3-part proof, or Romans has a 7-part proof, First Thessalonians has a 3-part proof, and then you can see that recapitulated in the peroratio, and then you have some kind of course, not in the in letters, you have the exhortation at the end of letters. So when you can see that structure in several letters, and then you can show parallels between that structure in certain Pauline letters, maybe not every Pauline letter, but in certain Pauline letters that are well organized, with speeches, minus, of course, the exhortation at the end of letters, then that is a way, that can be a way, and I think is a way of actually demonstrating those letters which are coherent. Okay, here is what the coherence consists of. And that's what we tried to do in our rhetorical analyses, and I did in chapters 5 and then 7 through 12 in our Corinthian book. And then I tried to do that in my article on First Thessalonians in Raymond Collins' collection in 1990. So rhetorical criticism, going a step further or several steps further from form criticism of letters, can be a way of showing or arguing for the coherence of those letters which are coherent. And also they can also be a way of arguing for the composite nature of those letters which certainly appear to be composite in nature, namely the First Corinthians and Second Corinthians. And that's what we have tried to do.
Yeah, that shows the utility of an ideal type, that the rhetorical structure you ably describe, and suddenly if it's veering off, you got to wonder why. So the yardstick is not an oversimplification, trying to jam everything into a formula. It's rather a way of focusing on the aberrations to understand why they're there. I mean, it's you can't lose either way. It helps understand where the material that does fit the type, the ideal type of genre and so forth, but it also helps you understand what doesn't. You know, gee, why are they? Why is it this odd anomaly in there? And you win both ways.
Well, yeah, we know a lot about well taught all around the Mediterranean Sea, and First Thessalonians has strong characteristics of epideictic rhetoric, and the standard topics of epideictic rhetoric are praise and blame, which is why I don't get uptight about First Thessalonians 13 through 16. Maybe I should, but I never have. You know, praise and blame. And then Bob Jewett agreed with me that Second Thessalonians is a tightly organized deliberative letter. And of course, in deliberative rhetoric, what are your standard topics? Advantage and honor. And it's interesting in Second Corinthians 8, our letter D is phrasing. He's asking for money, and he basically starts with the topic of advantage. Okay, if you give money, then those poor redneck Macedonians, when they have money, they'll give money to help you. See? And then after he has exploited the topic of advantage, he goes to the topic of honor. And what is the the ultimate honor? Well, you are Corinthians, you have money. And by the way, you want to remember the poverty of our Lord Jesus Christ. The ultimate exemplum of honor is Jesus. And so in that letter, you have the topics of honor and advantage used, exclusively in that one chapter in 2 Corinthians 8. So, and of course, those are the deliberative topics, and in deliberative speeches, you're trying to get them to change their policy to do something different in the future. And of course, what he's trying to do in Corinthian letter D is for them to raise the money so that he can have the money to for the relief of the Christians in Jerusalem. So Paul can use the topics of rhetoric. He doesn't follow the handbooks of rhetoric slavishly by any means, but he's not unaware of the precepts about rhetoric, and he can use them. He can use the standard topics as any well-trained person who had studied grammar and rhetoric and maybe philosophy, but especially rhetoric. That's exactly what you were trained to do in rhetorical schools. So why do we have a problem with Paul using rhetoric? I don't know. We don't have a problem with Tertullian using rhetoric. We don't have a problem with any of the fathers of the church using rhetoric. Why should we have a problem with, St. Paul in his letters using rhetoric? Because he can't be there in person all the time. Therefore, he sends his deputies. But before he sends his deputies, he writes these letters and tries to convince them to, be unified or to do whatever. And so it's not hard to believe that Paul uses rhetoric and can use it in a very well-informed way.
Mm-hmm. He like Tertullian, I think he denies that he is using any special fancy delivery. I just give you the straight facts, and it's going to sound stupid to some people. It's going to sound offensive to others, but I can't help that. It's Christ crucified, and yet he does use the whiz bang technique very effectively. He then says, among a certain group, I do impart wisdom. You're not necessarily ready for it, but it's like he's covering all the bases. I'm all things to all men, so that I might by any means save.
You're clearly not ready for it. When I begin of chapter 8. Yeah, you weren't ready for it, and you still are not ready. You're still fleshly.
Yeah, wow.
Etc.
Well,
but also in 1 Corinthians 1.
Mm-hmm.
In 1 Corinthians 1, he also kind of denies using rhetoric, but of course he is using rhetoric. I mean, Demosthenes and Cicero do the same thing.
I want to take some super chats. You've been waiting a long time.
Jacob, we've lost you.
No, I'm here.
I got you.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. Paul's disputed letter written by him.
I hear you.
The iceberg of what's irritating to me. I have Bible research. I quit looking all of this. I think that's what he said there. The creator of the universe has done a bad job. Not being reliable makes no sense.
You mean you're blaming God for where the Bible doesn't make sense? It's like you're taking on the claim of fundamentalism. Oh, this is no mere human writing. And well, if it's superhuman, I don't see how. A lot of folks still don't like Paul. Things haven't changed much.
I think the writer of this super chat seems to be. He says the disputed letter. He doesn't say which disputed letter, but let's say any of the Corinthian letters. in their redacted state, it's the tip of the iceberg of what's irritating. Well, yeah. On the other hand, part of the time, like 1 Corinthians 13, people misunderstand that and they say, oh, it's a hymn to love, you know. But I think that the approach that I take is to try to interpret each of the letters as situationally as possible. But I think that irritates other people too. That irritates systematic theologians for sure.
Yeah, that's true. I remember I've known in dialogue with various members of the Unification Church some years ago now, and one of them said, if you look at Reverend Moon's speeches, often they're inconsistent. You couldn't just read systematic theology off them. And I thought that was a pretty realistic assessment. But are you willing to say the same would be true of any author of scripture? Because that does imply, well, hold on, this isn't simply dictated by God. It's more human than not. And I guess Constellation Pegasus is a little sick of all the Bible bullying, that this comes right from the hand of God, and it doesn't sound like it to me, saying.
All right, so I'm going to take
somehow
the next.
In religious communities haven't really been taught just how situational a thinker and writer Paul is, or how situational Paul as a whole, Paul's letters as a whole are, and that there are many voices within the Bible, Christian writings, or the whole Bible. I mean, so that people have these I hate to say it, childish ideas about the Bible, and then they come to a university like yours, or they come to seminary and they, when you start telling them about certain things about the Bible and about teacher of the Bible to tell them the stuff that they've always believed. And of course, that sometimes gets us into hot water. And you know that as well as I do.
Though then occasionally you have somebody perhaps older than the young students who this is a revelation to them, and they say, why didn't they ever tell me any of this stuff in church? I said, well, you don't have to think too hard to figure that one out. Get out of here, heretic. But they're ready for solid food, no more pablum. And that's why I think that those of us engaged in an intellectual approach to the Bible are at least analogous to the ancient Gnostics. We have to use a sort of discretion, like, well, he didn't have much, but Diogenes, where he was the old saw that he was going around like Nietzsche's madman with a lantern in the daytime. And what are you doing? There's plenty of light. He says, well, I'm looking for an honest man. And it's hard to find them. So even in this light, I got to scrutinize. I think that's like Jesus and the rich young ruler. What do I have to do to inherit eternal life? Well, you know, don't you? What about the commandments? Oh, yeah, sure. I know that, but there's got to be something more. And Jesus says, okay, good for you, buddy. Here's the more. And I think it's, I guess there's no point in overturning the apple cart or rocking the boat for somebody who does just have a kind of childlike approach to it, you're probably doing them no favor. But if you can tell they've come to the point where the childlike approach is now a burden to them, well, you can help them graduate to the true gnosis of biblical criticism.
All right, let me take the next super chat. Oh, I skipped one. Here we are. Jennifer Solves, thank you for your super chat. The creator of the universe.
Well,
so
I
many
think
have
that's,
seen
and I think
and
we do
communicated with the
either
machine
teachers
self.
in universities or seminaries or parish clergy like me. This is the way we look at these biblical texts, and here's what the text says, and then looking at the text, and here are the methods that we use. You look at the text, and here are the conclusions to which we come.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, put your cards on the table.
I always tell people that seem to be opposed to biblical criticism, I say, look, to me, the best approach to the Bible is the one that makes it the most understandable. Even if it creates new problems, there's nothing more pious than understanding the text. And if my method will solve some of these questions, answer some of these questions that you've always wondered about, but yours does not, because it's a set of blinders, who's got the better approach? I welcome you to try it out.
You both heard
Well,
me read
that's
this.
what I've tried to do.
Right? I think
And,
there's some lag. I think there's some lag in the connection where one of us has a little bit of a delay.
Yes, I think so.
Or two of us even. But Jennifer said, the creator of the universe, so many have seen and communicated with the machine elves, yet here we are blaming God for the Bible.
Reference to Terence McKenna there with the broad widening of consciousness, the doors of perception through hallucinogens. And are you suggesting that's a true divine revelation, whereas the Bible may have been that in its day, but we don't really need it? There are other ways of access to this larger world. I'm not into that stuff because I'm scared of going insane. But I know a lot of people are, and McKenna was a genius for sure. Don't know what he thought about the Bible.
Well, I think, I think that it may be helpful to talk to people and say, okay, the Bible in my tradition inspired. Okay, we accept the Bible as inspired, but our interpretations of the Bible are not inspired. We'd like them to be, but they're not biblical text. But that doesn't mean just because you have a particular theory of inspiration, that doesn't mean that the exegetical problems, the problems of interpretation historically and otherwise, the problems haven't gone away.
Right.
And so you can revere the text and you can respect the text and you can believe in God who inspired the text, but that doesn't mean the problems of how that text got to be written by its human authors, and also what do we as human readers of the Bible, do about it. Those problems haven't gone away just because you have a particular theory of inspiration.
In fact, that multiplies the problems. You start having anxiety attacks over whether the mustard seed actually is the smallest seed on earth. I mean, if that's a problem, you made a wrong turn in Albuquerque, as Bugs Bunny used to say. If this is what it comes to, wait a minute, maybe you ought to go back and rethink this thing. So again, I say anything that makes it more understandable, though it raises new difficulties, that's got to be the way to go.
All right, let's go to the next.
Well, the Bible is a very diverse book. No matter what kinds of interpretations you deal with, it's going to be a very diverse book.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Paul, what Constellation Pickett says, thank you for your super chat. Was Paul deliberately misquoting the Hebrew Bible? If so, why would he do that?
Well, he may have just been quoting it from memory, and I don't know how many people had private copies of the scripture to carry around with him, but it may be that he just was used to thinking that a certain idea of his is well put by scripture when in fact he's unwittingly redacting it. I've occasionally looked up a passage thinking, yeah, I want to get the wording right. It doesn't say exactly what I thought it said. He may have done that innocently. It's possible he's twisting the text, but and there were ways of doing that that were highly regarded. Pesher exegesis and all that, we would consider it twisting the text, but he doesn't seem to be doing that. It's more elusive, it seems to me. In fact, I don't know if Paul really bases much of anything on the Old Testament. It's like it comes in handy as an illustration, like eating food previously offered to idols. He cites the thing with the thousands of Israelites.
Well, and the whole issue of are we?
Go ahead.
Yeah, but then the question is Paul actually quoting the Hebrew Bible, or is he really quoting the Old Greek, the Septuagint? And sometimes they differ. And of course, as we know from Cooney, sometimes when the Old Greek, the Septuagint differs from the Masoretic text, the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the Dead Scrolls iteration of the Hebrew Bible is closer than the Masoretic text, as we all know. So, I mean, was there really a firm text of the Old Testament? I certainly was taught there was not.
And if he's just making an allusion to well, as it says there, it almost doesn't matter if he's quoting it accurately. It's not really, his quotes are not necessarily proof texts.
Right.
Sometimes they are, but in fact, Origen, I was surprised reading him that a lot of the uses he makes of the Old Testament don't seem to me to be allegories. It's just literary allusion again. I'd need to go back over it and critically study it, but I wouldn't jump to the conclusion that there's anything all that deep going on when it could just be like a phrase from important source. If I quote something out of Shakespeare, I'm not invoking the scene as just a nice expression for something.
Right. Well, for example, look at Clement of Alexandria, his sermon on Quis dives salvator, which rich man is being saved, and he quotes the thing from Mark, and then he says, well, it differs a little bit from the others, and then he says he has this allegory. Well, it's even beyond allegory. I mean, he says, well, it says somewhere that some people get into the kingdom of heaven by importunity and violence. And that means that you pay holy people to pray you into heaven. And that God likes to be forced in this way. So, I mean, you can find some very, very interesting interpretations of scripture, in as early as Clement, who was, of course, Origen's successor in the Catechism. You can find all sorts of interesting allegorical things in the early church fathers. And so, Paul can do interesting things with the scriptures, but so did Jewish authors too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And so did the fathers.
Mm. Once I was involved with a skit at Gordon Conwell Seminary where we put on this phony game show. It's time to play Twist That Text, the show that gives you a chance to do your own biblical interpretation. And we had like the systematic theology wheel, which would stop randomly, giving you three grossly incompatible doctrines like universal salvation, predestination, so on. And you had 15 seconds to come up with a harmonization or the systematic theology, the prophecy gizmo, where you got two piles, one a randomly chosen Bible passage and the other a randomly chosen newspaper item. And you had to explain how one predicted the other, and just to show the arbitrariness of it. And it's often that's what people are doing, just playing Twist That Text.
We have some more super
Well,
chat.
I think you can definitely do that.
Hold on, Frank.
Yeah.
I think there might have been a delay there for a second. Let's get to the next super chat. Solara Knight, thank you for your super chat. Paul was invented to push the Roman imperial agenda to unify mystery cults, Mithraism, ISIS, Kabbali cults to combine with Judaism. Well, thank you for your super chat, Solara Knight, but that question's kind of not on topic with the stream. So I'm going to move on to the next one. Adam S., thank you for your super chat. Was Paul a Hellenistic Jew that converted himself to a Pharisee Jew, then back to a Hellenistic Jew?
Chaim Maccabee said that he thought Paul was, well, he accepted the authenticity of virtually all the epistles and a whole lot of the book of Acts. And he said, therefore, that when Paul claimed to have been an educated Pharisee, and when it says that he studied under Gamaliel, he says, Paul and maybe Luke are just lying. And because the way in the Pauline epistles, the writer deals with the text does not reflect rabbinic methods of interpretation, but sounds more like the Nag Hammadi texts. And so he's like a strangely compelled to make Paul a liar because he takes the text at face value. It's a strange paradox. I like the idea that the Ebionites said, but Paul was no Jew. He was a Gentile, and he converted so that he could marry the daughter of the high priest. But he found it such a burden to adjust to all the rules and mores that he said, well, forget it. And plus, he was supposedly rejected by the priest, didn't like him, and so he decided to show him what for by inventing a new anti-Jewish religion. I mean, that seems sort of crazy, but there are interesting aspects of it. Because like when Peter in Acts 15 says, we don't want to impose this burden on the Gentiles. We've never been able to bear it. What? This guy is a devout Jew as well as a Christian, and he sounds like Martin Luther. He's got to be, like Bauer said, using Peter as a ventriloquist dummy for Paul, but because that's the kind of thing no Jew would ever say. So at least they had a theory to explain it. Not a believable one, but But Maccabee was almost
Well,
saying something like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what do we know? You know, you can talk about what you think, but what do you know? Well, what do you know? Well, Paul wrote in Greek. Paul was a Greek-speaking Jew. Greek was his mother tongue. If he has something to do with Tarsus, Tarsus was the home of 7 known Stoic philosophers. And yet he can say of himself that he was a Pharisee, the children of Pharisees. I don't really buy that he studied with Gamaliel in Jerusalem, but nonetheless, you know, I think it's not really helpful to say, okay, the Hellenistic world is over here, and then Judaism is over there.
Right.
I think that can't work. That can't work, and we know better.
Yeah, great book, Paul. Judaism and Hellenism by Martin Hengel, where he shows a whole lot of the stuff we think of as archetypically Jewish comes from the Hellenistic world. The whole idea of a rabbi with his circle of disciples. Several of the hermeneutical rules, they came from Stoicism and so on. And so it's very, I mean, it was so permeated. Even in First Maccabees, where you have the Hasmoneans seeing progressing Hellenism and people learning pagan ways, exercising in the gym nude and so forth, and joining in the Dionysus festivals. They say, this is going too far. We got to do something to stop this. Well, that was a revitalization movement he started, and you don't have that unless the traditional culture is being overcome and swayed by an invading culture. So were all Jews anti-paganism? Well, of course not, or you wouldn't have had the Hasmonean rebellion. Said, hey, no, we don't do this. We're not supposed to. You know, you don't tell people to. Another professor of mine used to say, if you ever go to a bus station, you might see a sign saying, please don't spit on the floor, but you never see a sign saying, please don't spit on the ceiling, because everybody's already not doing that. So you just forbid what people are doing, and you don't want them to.
David Aaron Hill, thank you for your super chat. I find it odd that a prolific writer of the mid-1st century is only known from the mid-2nd century.
Has been said,
only because
a lot
of
has
conflicting canon.
Been said that of early Christian, I mean, you know, the whole thing of where do you get the pastoral epistles? You've got something called a Pauline school, whatever that means, you know. And so you have, you know, school tradition, but that, you know, the school tradition is a very diverse tradition. And the school tradition doesn't mean that everybody agreed with each other.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm going to reread the super chat here because there was a break in the connection. David Aaron Hill, thank you for the super chat. I find it odd that a prolific writer of the mid-1st century is only known from the mid-2nd century, and only because of a conflicting canon.
Well, if you take seriously the quotes and allusions to Pauline letters in the first letter of Clement, and if you give First Clement the date of, let's say, the last decade of the 1st century, that means that Paul was very well known by the end of the 1st century, and you have Ignatius of Antioch before the end of the 1st century, seeing himself as a Pauline imitator. So I think that Paul was known in the early church in the 1st century, by the end of the 1st century. But maybe in the early church the internet was down part of the time and the fax machine wasn't working. So why would you assume that just because somebody lived and wrote in the mid first century, that everybody in these different towns, different places would know of each other's writings?
Frank, can you hear me? I don't know if you said anything in the last 10 seconds, but you froze.
I did, or Bob did.
You froze for like 10 seconds.
Oh, well, I mean, given the quotations of Pauline letters in First Clement, which I'm very happy to date in the 90s, and given the quotations and the allusions to Paul as a martyr, Peter and Paul as martyrs in Ignatius of Antioch. Peter and Paul were known as martyrs by Ignatius, and he wants to imitate them. So I think that Paul was very well known in Greek-speaking Christian circles by the late first century and even before the late first century. Why? They were copying his letters. I mean, that's what Colossians 4:16 is all about. Okay, see the letter that I wrote to the Laodiceans, and then you share a copy of this letter with the Laodiceans. So, I mean, you only know about Pauline letters if somebody copied and circulated.
Frank, you froze again for like 6 to 7 seconds. Did you hear what I said, Frank?
No.
You froze for about 6 to 7 seconds, or about 10 seconds ago now. I think you froze again.
Maybe it'll be better. Maybe it'll be better after when StreamYard kind of takes the recordings from each of our computers. I hope it'll be better. But I alluded to the quotations of Pauline letters in Ignatius of Antioch and in First Clement, which is the end of the first century. So it did not take into, you didn't have to wait until the middle of the second century for early Christian congregations to get familiar with Pauline letters. They were being copied and they were being circulated in different places. By the end of the second century, well, even by the time of Marcion, there's a collection of Pauline letters. That didn't happen all at once. I hope you could hear that.
I did. All right, last super chat so far. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. Let's see, we've got historical, scientific, and textual serious issues. Horrible different Bible versions, changes, additions, no known authors. The creator didn't care about preserving his books. Just mental hostage taking.
Yeah, if God had really wanted to provide a definitive, infallible guidebook, why didn't he stop textual corruptions? Why didn't he make it clearer, less susceptible to wildly competing interpretations? Why does it not address so many issues, etc. It does sort of make you wonder if the Bible is being oversold, and because anything that is going to wind up being very disappointing, and that's what's happened. It just isn't. Well, I guess Clark Pennock once said, the fundamentalists don't like the Bible they've got. But they keep trying to dress it up as they wish it had been and make claims about it. I remember once when I was witnessing with somebody from my church youth group decades ago, this woman was telling a prospective convert, the Bible is the Word of God because it's never been proven wrong. And I thought to myself, that doesn't really mean that much, since we got a whole encyclopedia of harmonizations and far-fetched explanations for them. You're reading the Bible against the grain so that you can brag that it doesn't have problems. But that's one of the big problems. So which is it? Is it infallible, divine, because nobody's ever proven it wrong, or has no one ever admitted that it's wrong because they're have a prior commitment to saying it's the inspired Word of God? And circularity breeds contempt.
On the other hand, there have been excellent translations, for example, like the Revised Standard Version or the newest incarnation of the RSV, the NRSV Update Edition. And so over time, there have been some excellent translations of the Bible. And there have been a number of things that have improved our knowledge of the biblical languages and the biblical text. It doesn't happen all at once, but we've learned a lot about the Bible. I mean, the people in the 16th and 17th century didn't really know that much about Hebrew. They probably didn't know what Proto-Semitic was. They didn't have a very good understanding of Hebrew. They had a very corrupt New Testament text. But lo and behold, we have a much better text to translate now. They probably didn't know that much about Hebrew until Gesenius in the 1830s. So I think over time, our knowledge of the Bible and of reasonable ways to interpret the Bible has improved greatly. Mm. And that, I mean, if you go to the doctor's office, you don't ask for leeches, do you? You don't ask for the kind of doctors that set upon their patients like that wonderful movie, The Madness of King George.
Oh, never seen
where they burn the hell out of his back and all of that stuff to get rid of the vape humor. I mean, our understanding of the Semitic languages, has improved over time, and our understanding and our ability to really interpret the books, that's improved over time. Just as many other sciences have improved over time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think we'll close here. I'll have the links to purchase Frank and Bob's respective books in the description below and in the pinned comment. That being said, Frank and Bob, thank you both for joining me today.
Oh, it's great fun as always, and an honor to meet you, Frank.
It's been fun, and right. And Bob, are you going to
let me close with
the SB?
Let me close the stream real quick.
I can't afford it. I don't have any institutional backing, so I don't have to hitchhike.
Let me close the stream.
Maybe we can meet at SBL in Boston.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching the video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.